Mm-mm. Oh, the three wards? No.
There's like 31 other cities that you have to pick on, you know?
But the thing is, it's not really.
I know it's not a hard issue.
It's not really our record.
Don't they have those like posted on like on the state? Well, the first one is, which is who's on your period, but then they stay. And then
But I'm like, and that's what I responded to them. I'm like,
do we have
we
them?
may have some, but they're not required to give them to the.
Right.
Ones
Mail
are
it into
required.
the.
Exactly. You don't
Like I
have
do
to
with
mail
mine.
it.
Or you can do it online.
You just email it.
Right. Well, I guess we should give them whatever we have.
Of course.
But
And that's why I said what we have, but outside of that, how much we can do.
I think we had a good meeting today. You know, they get it. I mean, they get that, you know, and I made it clear. So they, you know, you need to move forward. You need to preserve that, you know, if this date work, for whatever reason, we'll just, you know, until it's fine. So there's a meeting from Tuesday. You guys are, right? Okay, so it's just the working thing.
I'll start drafting.
I'm good. How are you? My computer's muted.
Hello, testing, testing. Microphone.
So one of the issues as far as the light, as far as we stand up, where are they gonna be mounted?
They have to carry one of those things.
Okay. All right.
Can you tell me if you hear me? Just on the microphone, let me know if you hear me.
Well, just grab one of the mics and see how it sounds.
So I'm gonna talk. I have joined the meeting right now, so you should be able to hear me on speakers.
Okay.
So let me know if you can't hear me by just hitting the microphone and telling me yes, I can hear you.
Oh, just only with the microphones on the table.
Yep. All right. All right, Bill, can you hear me? You can hear me? Hello, hello, hello.
Check over 1 2.
Got it. Got it. Thank you.
Yeah, we got it. Testing, testing. Testing, testing, testing. Testing, 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 testing. Testing.
I am, but I don't hear a thing. Hey, I'm on Zoom, but I don't hear a thing. Okay, good. I'm about 10 minutes, 15 minutes away. All right.
have roll call, please.
Commissioner Drosky. Commissioner Parnes. Commissioner Preston.
Here.
Vice Mayor Hudak.
Here.
Mayor Gantz.
Here, we have approval of the agenda for tonight.
Motion to approve.
Motion by.
Second.
Seconded by Commissioner Drosky. All in favor, say aye.
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 For members of the public wishing to provide comments during tonight's meeting, if you're joined via Zoom video, hover your mouse at the bottom of the screen and click the Participants tab. Click Raise Hand on the right and you'll be recognized by your profile name. If you're joined via phone or landline, simply dial *9 to be recognized by the last 3 digits of your phone number. Thank you, Mayor.
Thank you, Mayor. This evening, we would like to present to you some rate study analysis and fund information that we have been working on with our consultants, particularly in all 3 of our major enterprise funds. With the assistance of our Deputy City Manager, Horace McHugh, he's been working with the departments and the consultants to put together these presentations for you this evening. And for me, this means a more comprehensive look at our enterprise funds as we move forward and as I move forward as your city manager, so that we can look at these things on a more regular basis and bring these things forward to the commission so that we stay abreast on our ability to fund the capital improvements and the operations necessary to maintain viability of these enterprises. So without further ado, I will go ahead and turn that over to Deputy City Manager Horace McHugh for further introduction.
Good afternoon, Mayor and Commissioners. So why are we here today? We're here to take a look at our enterprise funds and consider the long-term sustainability of these funds. And what are the enterprise funds? These are the business type funds, the business type entities that are funded by the users and the ratepayers, supposed to be self-sufficient and not necessarily burdened or supported by the government funds and by millage. So the intent is for them to be independent, adequately funded, and addressed like a business on a multi-year capacity. So with that, we're trying to be a little strategic in terms of bringing this to you for your review and to get some direction from you. And some of the things that we'll be looking for is to confirm the service levels, which impacts, whatever we're doing. Start determining operational needs to support the service levels. Start determining the capital needs to support the service levels, and determine funding. In some of these things, we need funding, and you may make the order and it's not delivered until 2 or 3 years. In other things, if it's a capital project, it requires permitting and design and construction, and it's not in service for a couple of years. So we'd like to get that direction from you so that at least we can move through some of these issues and look on a multi-year. In terms of financing, a lot of that would be determined by, not just the operation, but the rate. So we wanted to have the conversation comprehensively and not necessarily defer it until when we're having the budget conversation and we're just looking at it 1 year in isolation. So with that, the 3 areas that we plan on discussing today is, first of all, solid waste, and then secondarily, the water and sewer, and then the stormwater fund. So with that, we'll start with the solid waste, and I'll turn it over to our Director of Sustainable Management.
Good evening. Everybody hear me? Okay, great. Chad Gressick, Director of Sustainable Management. Next slide, please. So presentation tonight, we're going to go over a program overview, what we currently do, what the services we currently provide. We're going to talk about some of the challenges that we face in the industry, what measures we've implemented to mitigate those challenges. We're going to get into some background and history on the rate in the Solid Waste Fund. And then I'm going to turn it over to Mr. Thomas to my right, who will take over the findings of the rate sufficiency study. And then we'll certainly be available to answer any questions that you might have after that. Next slide, please. So you may or may not know, we are the only city in Broward County that provides full service collection, which means residential and commercial collections. We are the last in Broward County that does that. We have full control of our collection services, which is from my perspective a very good thing. So on the residential side, we provide approximately 17 to 18,000 single family home services on a weekly basis, twice a week garbage collection, once a week bulk. And although the curbside program for recycling is suspended, we do still go out there and we pick up those containers. We just take that material to the landfill or to the transfer station rather, as opposed to a processing center. On the commercial side, we have a healthy commercial program. We service approximately 1,200 dumpsters, 660 multifamily dumpsters. We still do have some single stream recycling dumpsters in the program. And we do have a very healthy roll-off service, which is the big construction dumpsters that get picked up when there's those bigger projects. In addition to those services, we do have 3 drop-off centers. We have our main drop-off center at the Central City campus, and then we have the 2 satellite drop-off centers, one on the east side, one on the west side, to help to promote some recycling out in those areas. This year, we are going to do 2 household hazardous waste collection events. One is scheduled for December after hurricane season, and then one is scheduled in June, which will be right before the heart of hurricane season. And the reason for that is we find a lot of residents have the fuel oil for their generators that they want to get rid of. So we use that opportunity for them to dispose of that material appropriately. On the metrics, we are running approximately 25 routes per day, 2,000 tons of materials we collect per week, which comes out to about 100,000 tons per year. We are averaging about 84 pounds of solid waste and bulk materials that are generated per single family per home per week. And that's about in the range of the national average, which is interesting because we do have a lot of seasonality here in Deerfield Beach. So you would think our number would be a little lower. But that just indicates that we do create a lot of materials here in Deerfield Beach. Last but not least, we have a very busy recycling drop-off center. We have approximately 1,400 visitors a month, which is about 50 per day. So Joe, if you guys know Joe out there, he's very busy and he's a fantastic ambassador for our department and the city as well. Next slide, please. So what I want to do here is these are just some various headlines out there throughout the state, recent headlines, some of the challenges that the industry is facing. These are not unique to Florida. These are certainly not unique to these areas. We face these same challenges, thankfully not to this degree. But as you can see, service impacts, staffing issues, significant rate increases. A lot of this is caused because of COVID. A lot of this is just stuff that has been kind of built up, and what COVID did was sort of release the floodgates, so to speak, on some of these issues. So next slide, please. So what are the challenges that we face specifically? As you know, we've talked about it in great detail, personnel shortages, specifically on the mechanic side. But now we're actually seeing shortages on the driver side. We're actually short six driver collectors at the moment, which is why we have to use that temp service that, we had to come before you because we have to fill those gaps. We need people to, do the work. We can't find full-time workers. We have to do it somehow. So we've been dealing with that. Hopefully that's something that's starting to change. We're starting to see a little bit of movement on the mechanic side. But again, we're still facing some significant challenges there. Supply chain impacts. Horace indicated that we're delayed on equipment purchases. We purchased a garbage truck in November of 2021. We were told we're not going to get it till 2023 of April 2023. So that just compounds the challenges that we have. Obviously, rising costs. We all know about that. Fuel costs, parts, labor, steel. The next one is a big one, disposal. So disposal makes up a significant part of our budget and our expense. And our current disposal contract is set to expire this June. And the vendor has basically already indicated to us that they can't renew on the same terms. So we're probably looking at fairly significant price increases in disposal in the very near future. Equipment issues. Again, all those things above sort of compound the equipment issues. So we don't have enough mechanics. The equipment is old. It's overused. So that results in higher repairs, higher maintenance costs, delivery issues that I mentioned, parts issues, cost increases on the equipment, on the supplies. Obviously, the fleet doesn't look as good as we'd like it to look out there. And the useful life of that equipment is being extended past what it actually should be used for. And that does not allow us to adhere to a really strict vehicle replacement schedule so that we can make sure that we're, reducing those maintenance costs and maintenance charges. A specific example here is our bulk collection fleet, which is the claw trucks. On average, our fleet is 11 years old. The industry recommendation is 8. So those trucks are running past the hours and the years that they should. Next slide, please. So, we've had to do a lot of different things to address these challenges. Since I've been in charge, since 2012, we've eliminated a lot of collection routes, and probably too many at this point, to be honest. It's one of the things that COVID showed us is that our bench strength is not where it needs to be. When we had a lot of individuals out sick, we did not have the ability to cover that. And because we had to cut, and we've been cutting, so with that, we've reduced 6 positions since 2014. You see the salary savings there. We've improved safety practices and training for our drivers. You're aware of the bulk reroute that we did. That's been tremendously successful, and it's helped us to, again, extend the life of that bulk collection fleet. Excuse me. We actually have the lowest disposal rate in Broward County right now. And I'm proud of that. The fact that we have the lowest in the county, those are going up countywide. And as I mentioned, we've had conversations with our vendor, and the numbers are a lot higher than what we're paying right now, unfortunately. So those conversations are ongoing, and hopefully, we'll have something to bring forward to you in the near future on that. Obviously, we suspended our recycling program. That's saving us approximately $400,000 a year. The conversion from diesel to CNG, this is just the fuel-to-fuel comparison. We're saving about $100,000 a year on that alone. In addition to minimizing our expenses, we've got to maximize our revenues. So one of the things that we've done is we've transitioned our commercial billing into a solid waste management system that's specially designed for the type of work that we do. We did that in 2017. We've hired specific individuals with solid waste business manager experience. One of them is in a room today, thankfully. A billing coordinator. We focused on collecting delinquent payments. And through all those efforts, we've been able to increase our revenues since 2018 by approximately $1.1 million. Next slide, please. So this table is a bit of a walk down memory lane, so to speak. So prior to 2008, the fund had an annual rate adjustment of 2 to 3%. In 2008, we all kind of remember what happened around 2008. The big economic crash. That was the last fund-wide rate adjustment upwards, and that was a 4% increase. And then between 2011, 2013, there were a lot of interesting things going on in the county. The resource recovery system that the city was part of dissolved. Disposal rates dropped, which was certainly a good thing for us. And then as part of the settlement that the cities had with Broward County, we were provided a one-time payment of approximately $1.7 million. All of that money, so to speak, all that savings fairly quickly went back towards the residents, which certainly was the right thing to do. The residents were given a 1-month credit in 2015. and that was a revenue impact of approximately $350,000. And then also in 2015, we actually reduced the residential rate from $22.34 or from $24.54 to $22.34, which is about a 9% reduction. And that's an annual hit to the revenue of approximately $435,000. In addition to that, because we heard a lot about litter and litter control throughout the city, there was a new division created called the Sanitation Division. And that division initially was an expense of almost $1 million. And the challenge there was really no revenue to offset that work. So that was a challenge, and that was something that really impacted the fund. So in 2020, the division was actually dissolved, and a lot of the functions were moved into other departments. So the litter removal function is still within my department. The beach, parks, special events, trash removal, and management is now in Parks and Recreation. And then you may remember the Getting Litter boat, the vessel that would go out on the canals to pick up litter. That's now under the Stormwater Division. And by dissolving that Stormwater Division, or the Sanitation Division rather, we saved approximately $849,000 in expense. Next slide, please. As you're aware, there was recently the city did its annual comprehensive financial report, and this was a specific finding within that report. It found that the fund, there was a deficit. The cause was obviously because of the rates not being sufficient, as well as the OPEB, and I've had to write that down, other post-employment benefits. And essentially those are benefits that the city pays for individuals that no longer work for the city, but they're receiving a benefit of, from the city. And that used to be sort of a one-time charge that we could reflect. However, because of some changes in the government reporting structure, that was required to be provided now as like a go forward. So that was a tremendous impact to the funds, to the enterprise funds. The effect, obviously, what they've indicated is that it could impact the city's bond ratings as well as other financial indicators. And the recommendation was that the city consider reviewing the solid waste rates and ensure that the rates are sufficient to basically run our operations. Next slide, please. So in addition to the audit, the CAFR, there was also an external operational audit that was conducted. And in August of 2022, preliminary finding was consistent with the CAFR, indicating that the city should evaluate the solid waste enterprise fund as well as all enterprise funds to make sure that the rates are sufficient to support the fund and the collection costs. Next slide, please. So we initially engaged Raftellus, which is the rate study specialist, the rate sufficiency specialist in fiscal year 2019 to conduct the rate sufficiency study. Obviously, because of COVID-19, we suspended all expenses and put a halt to that work. And then we reinitiated that work at the beginning of this fiscal year, or last fiscal year rather. And here we are today to present the findings. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Mr. Henry Thomas, who's with Raftellus, who will go over the rate sufficiency study findings. Thank you.
Thank you, Chad. Good evening. So we'll start out, we'll talk a little bit about some background and the tasks that were part of the engagement to look at your sanitation rate sufficiency. We'll talk about assumptions that were incorporated into the study, keeping in mind that the rates are predicated on the projection of the operations over the next 5 years. So we needed to make some assumptions about future costs, primarily as Chad pointed out, labor being a major one, disposal costs, fuel costs, etc. So we factored in some assumptions about not only where we are today in our financial position, but where we're likely to be with our costs moving forward. We then match that up with the revenues that are produced by existing rates and some assumptions about future growth, and determine what kind of rate adjustments were needed. So Again, as Chad pointed out, the next slide, please. Chad pointed out oh, okay, I'm sorry here. So basically the tasks that we looked at, and it's basically a balancing act. We look at the revenues, gross revenues of the system, which include, again, the rate revenues that are produced, as well as interest income and such, that all make up gross revenues. Rate revenues are then compared, or gross revenues are compared to your requirements, which obviously include your operations, day-to-day operating expenses, labor costs, disposal costs, capital needs for fleet. And in this case, we're relying on, because of the situation with respect to fund balance, we've got some debt in the form of capital leases to allow us to start replacing fleet on an economical basis. Ideally, we'd like to purchase those vehicles, but given the condition of the fund today, that's not practical. So the plan is to develop some leases to upgrade the fleet, and then as those leases time out, as those leases are paid off, move in a direction where in the future, on a more normal basis, we can purchase new vehicles for the fund without having to incur the interest expense associated with financing. Next slide, please. So one of the things that we wanted to make sure we could do was to achieve an overall positive cash flow in the fund. So when we looked at this 5-year plan, the idea was to phase in rates and have rates that are adequate and achieve positive cash flow. Another important consideration was very importantly, we need to get some operating reserves built back into the system. Essentially, your operating reserve fund doesn't exist today. We need some reserves. We've set up a target within the 5-year plan to have a minimum balance of 60 days of rate revenues, with a target balance, if we can achieve it, of 90 days. And again, one of the reasons for operating reserves is, changes in fuel costs that we don't anticipate. We need to have reserves on hand to be able to deal with that, so we don't have to immediately adjust rates. Disposal costs and the timing of those changes. Again, as an enterprise fund, one of the key elements to your health of that enterprise fund is having adequate reserves. The other thing that we looked at was, you have an emergency fund that's required by city policy. In here, what we're really dealing with is, obviously in Florida, when we have storm events and the debris removal that's required results in the need for immediate infusion of funds. FEMA does stand behind our local governments to allow us to get some reimbursement for some of these costs, but you need to have a healthy emergency fund to be able to sustain through these events. And currently, that fund was depleted because it was being used to pay for operations. So again, wherever we can minimize and mitigate bill impacts to ratepayers, we want to do that. But at this point, we're in a position where we need some pretty significant rate increases. Next slide, please. So some background on the system. You serve approximately, and Chad went over some of this, approximately 18,000 accounts today. Roughly 90% of them are residential, 10% non-residential. We've assumed in the 5-year plan that you'll grow approximately 234 accounts per year, or 1.3% annually. That's based on recent historical trends, discussion about new development within the community that's occurring. And so we have accounted for revenue from new growth to be available to help pay costs. Existing rate revenues with no rate increases would start out at about 17.4 million a year. And over the 5-year plan at that 1.3% growth rate would grow to about 17.7 million. So with that growth rate, over a 5-year period, it'll generate an additional $300,000 in revenue just due to growth. The other operating revenues, sale of fixed assets, scrap metal, miscellaneous revenues that the system collects are very minimal, approximately 72,000 a year. And because of the fund balances over the forecast period, interest income that we could count on as a gross revenue is very minimal. And even with the building up of the fund balances, only averages less than $5,000 a year in interest income on our funds. Next slide, please. So this just is a breakdown of the operations expenses and where the money's going. And you can see that the major expenditures are personnel. You've got disposal and recycling as a major expenditure. There are general fund transfers that are transferred from the sanitation fund to the general fund. These are typically operating expense type items, a share of support services costs. Examples would be human resources, finance. So the funds, the enterprise funds, get a share of those. You've got maintenance related costs. And again, even though it's growing significantly, you've also got some fuel expense in here that isn't today a major cost, but it is one of the fastest growing costs. And then you have some outstanding debt right now that was incurred to expand fleet or replace fleet. So that's what's that's the debt in the 2022 budget. Next slide, please. So this just looks at those same expense categories and how they're growing over time. We factored in, and this is, I'll say, quite conservative given the market we're in today. So we haven't, I believe, overstated the case. We've got labor costs growing at 3.7% per year. Health insurance at about 8% a year. Repairs and maintenance costs tend to outstrip inflation. It's growing at 5% a year. Disposal costs historically have been fairly stable, 3.5% a year. Our general inflation rate we've assumed, which is a little more front end loaded, but over the 5-year, it's at roughly 3.3% per year. And then the fuel costs, and this is over the increases we've already had to incorporate in our operations. So again, fuel costs growing 6.4% over the next 5 years. So when we average out all the costs, labor being a major component, that has our operating expenses growing at about 4.4% annually. Next slide, please. So again, we haven't adjusted rates since 2008. Prior to that, you were doing annual adjustments of about 2 to 3% a year. You actually reduced rates in 2015, both monthly rates and there were some credits that you got from the disposal negotiations that helped sustain the fund because you got those monies and were able to use them within the fund. But again, you know, the operations has undertaken cost mitigation measures. So we've got the route optimization, solid waste management system. We're trying to transition, you know, we've transitioned to natural gas as our fuel, eliminated collection routes, suspended. So we've done quite a bit to try to mitigate costs. Now, we haven't changed the level of service, and I know that's a discussion that Chad said he wanted to have with you, because again, we're still picking up the trash twice a week for the residential customers, and those are variables that you can look at in your operations and would have an effect on your overall costs. Again, if we look at that 2008, during that period where we really didn't raise rates, the one-time reduction really reflected cost reduction, so that was appropriate. But you basically had a cumulative 35% increase in your inflation rate since 2008, with basically no rate increases to support that kind of inflation. And obviously, the major impact of that was on your labor costs and such. And then, of course, we're looking at inflation right now that's unprecedented. I've been doing this almost 40 years now, and this has been one of the most difficult years for utility enterprise planning that I've experienced, just because of the uncertainty about the current level of inflation, when it may abate. We're counting on this program. We're counting on inflation to return to more normal levels in the near future, but I don't think some of these costs are going to go back down necessarily now that they've gone up. For example, labor costs. So next slide, please. So with respect to the capital improvement projects, if you will, this is related to your fleet, and you've got a garage gas detection system. That's a safety issue. It's $250,000 investment. You've got a need for front load trucks over the next 5 years that total about $3 million. You got a need for roll-off trucks at about 1.6 million. And then your grapple bulk waste collection vehicles, you've got an expenditure need of about 1.9 million. As Chad pointed out, your fleet is aged beyond its service life. And if we don't make these kind of investments, we're going to be in a position where we're going to have more failures and less reliable service. So this is the critical aspect. Not only are we seeing increases in operating expenses, but we've kind of gotten behind on our fleet replacement, and we need to move that forward in a positive way. And it's going to be critical to this fund being sustainable and healthy and providing the service that your citizens expect. So the CIP is funded to a small level directly from rate revenues for some minor expenditures. And then we're using, again, proposed capital leases for the major expenditures on your fleet. And that total over 5 years, by the way, was $10.9 million. Okay, so right now you have two outstanding leases. You've got one with JP Morgan. It's about just under $12,000 annually. It will be paid off in 2023. You've got with TD Bank, you've got a loan, $255,000 annually. Now it's got a little longer term. It will not be paid off until 2035. In order to allow for time for the phased-in rate increases to improve your financial position, to get us back where we have reasonable levels of reserves. In the meantime, we also need to do these fleet replacements. So we've got 5 additional short-term leases. They're 3-year leases. They're layered through the forecast period. So the lease amounts over the 5 years start out at about $778,000 and will climb to about 1.9 million as we add all the vehicles that are needed for replacement. So again, that's phased in. Now, starting in 2027, as those 3-year leases mature, we anticipate that those amounts will go down. And again, by phasing in the rates and having reasonable reserves, we want to transition to pay-go funding for this department. So in the long run, that'll produce the lowest cost. In the short run, if we tried to solve your vehicle asset replacement problems with rate revenues, it would mean immensely large rate increases to be able to raise that much money. So that's why we're going to use some capital leases, but then over time transition to the more effective way of of being able to purchase the vehicles. And that's just going to take some time as we get the health of the system back. Next slide, please. So this just shows over the 5 years, the debt service, including what's going on. The gray shaded area at the bottom is existing debt. The darker area is the proposed payments. And as you can see, as the leases, which are spread out, they're not all at the beginning of the 5-year period. So they're spread out over time. So some of them are starting to come off actually by 2027. Next slide, please. So the other thing that we need to deal with is working capital reserves, emergency fund balances. So right now your operating fund is effectively, the balance is effectively zero. We have planned into this to build the operating fund up over 5 years. Total deposits over 5 years of about $3.5 million in that fund. That would give us, if we can achieve that, target fund balances right at about our 90-day target and over and above our 60-day minimum. So we don't want to, when we set the minimum, that's sort of, if we go below that, that's really needs some attention. So we give ourselves a little cushion and set the 90-day target, and we're trying to achieve that over 5 years. The emergency fund requirement, and this is per city policy, is 5% of revenues. So right now that emergency fund is depleted and it needs to be restored, particularly as we go through each year in hurricane seasons. We need to get some money back in that fund. So the rate increases have allowed for a $630,000 deposit in 2023. And then following that, we would do an additional $63,000 a year over the period 2024 through 2027. But that gets us back into a situation where we can actually deal with emergencies then that would occur. Right now, with no operating reserves and no capital emergency funds, if we did have emergency events and storms that we had to deal with, obviously you're going to have to look at other sources other than the sanitation fund to take care of that. So next slide, please. So this just shows the operating expenses, which obviously, while our utility funds and such have a lot of non-operating costs included within them, when you look at the sanitation fund, it's primarily operating expenses. There are transfers that go to the general fund, and there are some capital needs that need to be funded. But if you can see here on this chart that the vast majority of the costs are operating expenses. Now, the key here to this plan is without a rate increase, you won't even be able to cover your operating expenses next year, let alone fund fleet replacement, fund increases to the reserve balances. You're in a situation right now that we need to, we're in a hole and we need to get out of it. And we have to be at least somewhat aggressive initially so that we can turn this around and then get back to more normal kinds of increases on a year-over-year basis. Next slide, please. So this just shows you here what the fund balances look like now in 2022 at that near zero level, and how over time, while we can't correct everything at once, how we're trying to build up both the emergency fund, and it does take a pretty significant step up in 2023 and then grows slowly, but also the operating fund. And you can see that the total cash fund balance is represented by the area on that chart, and the targets for the funds are shown the dash line. So the 90-day target is the top line, the 60-day target is the middle line. So I'm sorry, the top one is 120 days. So next slide, please. This is just a rate comparison, and I have to apologize. eyesight isn't seeing it real well. That's pretty small too. It's not fun getting old. So the current rate you're charging is $22.34 for a single family residential. We're proposing that go to $25.36. So that's a $3.02 per month increase. Currently in this average, which are Broward County systems, the average is $28.84. So even with this increase, which is significant, we're going to be below the survey average. And you can see by looking at the bottom of the chart that it is communities that are Broward County communities, Sunrise, Lauderhill, Coconut Creek. Again, we haven't tried to pick up systems that have high costs to compare to or low cost. This is very much a regional comparison. So one of the things that we did, next slide, please. One of the things that we did that would allow us to maintain more reasonable residential rates was we took a look at the fact that unlike some communities, you provide service to commercial service properties. So in doing that, when we look out around the communities that are your neighbors, and many of them use private haulers, it's clear that while your residential rates are comparable, your commercial rates were much lower than other communities. So one of the things we did was we said, let's take a market-based approach at this. Let's raise the commercial rates based on market in a manner that would put them in a position where if they had a choice, they would be indifferent, because right now, if they have a choice, they're going to choose Deerfield Beach because your rates are much lower. So we've increased the commercial rates and the kinds of services you can see there. And some of it's pretty significant, but keep in mind, these are charges that these entities throughout the region are already seeing in this level. And you can see that while the $3.02 increase in 2023 over 5 years is going to need to rise to just about $32. So again, part of the reason we can do that and keep those rate increases as low as we have is we're significantly increasing the commercial rates, particularly in 2023, and then they would continue to go up more in line with the residential rates beyond 2023. So we're making a market adjustment in 2023. That's going to allow us to have a sustainable, reasonable increase on residential. And then we'll go back to more normal increases for commercial beyond 2023. But again, we're proposing to you that a lot of the catch up that we need to accomplish, we can accomplish by increasing commercial rates to what they look like in this market today. Next slide, please. So this just is an attempt to illustrate your rate path, and this is the dollars for residential rates. So that green bar at the bottom shows you we're at $24.54. You lowered the rates to $22.34, and then you've sustained that for 14 years. Now, if you compare that to just CPI, which a lot of our costs, at least the labor costs, are certainly reflective of CPI increases. That's the blue line at the top. You can see what the CPI has done. So clearly over the last 14 years, it's trended upward. And then the very right-hand side of the chart, that's our proposal on the single family residential rates to turn this around and begin increasing rates to have this fund be more sustainable. So even though that path has a pretty good escalation to it, you can see that we're still below where we would have been had we just done inflationary increases for the last 14 years. So this just shows you what we did on the commercial rates. You can see here that we looked at the various kinds of service you provided, and these are the ones that are the more common. A commercial 4-yard dumpster, once a week service. Your current rate was less than $230. And you can see what your neighboring communities, what those customers are paying. And so what we did was the rate we're proposing for these commercials is slightly above average, but again, trying to bring that rate up, and that's the green bar to the right, more in line with what other communities are charging commercial customers. So the next one, please, shows the 20-year commercial 20-yard roll-off. Again, you can see that your rate is among the lowest, and again, we're moving it up to be more comparable. For the next slide, do we have another one for? No, okay. So in summary, you've got tremendous needs to fund fleet operation costs. We've seen major inflation impacts on fuel. Labor costs have gone up and will continue to. So given that your current rates will not support your current cost levels, as I pointed out to you, without a rate increase, you won't even be able to pay your operating expenses. So the existing rates would also have you fall short of the concerns that your auditor made in terms of deficits and reserves. So this is a plan to correct the situation, move forward, and hopefully as we move through this, we'll see more normal types of increases on an annual basis and not the steeper increases that we need to implement today. Next slide. So is this, you want me to do this one too? Okay. So again, our recommendations are that you consider adopting the rate schedule that's in the report for the 20 through 22 rate schedules. Now, again, having those rates in place will be important when you try to get capital financing for your vehicle leases, because they're going to want to make sure that the fund is sustainable and can repay those debts. We addressed the audit concerns. We got rid of the fund deficit. We've achieved positive cash flows over the forecast period, and we've put the emergency fund back on a solid footing. We're replacing a significant, about almost 10.6 million in capital needs in the plan. We've got our target of 90-day plus of operating is achieved, but we did take fully 5 years to do it. The idea is to phase in the rate increases so that it's not abrupt. We brought the commercial rates in line with market, and really the residential rates are more in line with your pre-2015 rates now, but at least initially, and are still below the Broward County average. Under this plan that we're talking about tonight, and these increases and these capital needs, we are assuming that you're going to maintain your current service levels. So that's twice a week solid waste, weekly bulk. Again, we're not doing the recycling programs, but we are still picking it up. And then quarterly paper sheds and annual events, and maintaining the drop-off centers. So if we move forward and we adopt these rate increases as recommended, you'll be able to maintain current service levels and fund your capital needs. So again, one of the things that we may want to come back and talk about in the future, depending on how it goes, is how we deal with disposal rate increases. That's a big expenditure you don't have any control over, just like your fuel costs you don't have control over, but it's a fairly minor expenditure. But when we looked back at that breakdown of your operating expenses, disposal is a major one. I think, okay. So.
Okay, thank you, Henry. So Yeah, what are the alternatives to the recommended 5-year rate plan? Obviously, we don't have to do anything. And what that will result in most likely is the deficit will continue to increase. It certainly obviously ignores the findings that were found in both of the audits. Our service levels will be impacted, and they have been impacted, and that hurts our group. I mean, when we can't provide the service that we want to provide, that causes a significant morale issue within our group. Because we want to do it, we want to provide that service, but we can't sometimes. And again, as per the CAFR report, by not doing anything, it could impact the city's financial bond ratings and other financial indicators. We could look at increased support from the general fund to help support the solid waste fund. Obviously, that's going to result in millage rate implications. One of the things that is, I believe, planned for this fiscal year is a cost allocation study. Currently, the solid waste fund provides in this fiscal year $3.6 million back to the general fund. That's 20% of our overall fund expense. That's a significant amount. If that amount is adjusted, that would provide some level of relief. Enough? I'm not sure. Obviously, we could look at modifying service levels. I deal with the residents every day, as I'm sure you do. I'm not sure that would go over very well here. And then, of course, last but not least, you certainly can look at outsourcing components and service. As I said in the outset, one of the best things that we do here is we control everything from a collection standpoint. And that's really why we've been able to sustain the rates for so long, is because we control it. If this was a private sector run operation, you're looking at cost adjustments annually. There's no doubt. There's no doubt. So with that said as well, you may recall during Hurricane Irma, our city was one of, if not the first, to be clean in all Broward County. And I say that is most likely because of the fact that we had our own equipment. We had our own staff to be able to supplement the contractors that came in to help us do the work. But as you may recall, there was a delay. There was a delay as the resources, we had to fight for resources with everybody else. We were able to get a good head start because we had our own internal staff to do the work. We had control. As I said, annual increases would be guaranteed. We certainly expect that there would be some impacts to the customer service experience. And ultimately, the measures may not address the concerns. So with that, I believe that's the end of our presentation. I'll hand it back over to Forrest.
Yeah, Mayor and Commissioners, that concludes our presentation. We have made a recommendation, and realizing that you may ask for some questions, some alternatives, we have offered some alternatives that you may want to consider or discuss. And we are here, staff as well as a consultant, to address any questions or concerns that you may have.
Thank you. I have a couple of questions. So right now, when we have a deficit with what we're operating in, the funding in order for us to operate comes from the general fund. Is that correct? To make up for where we fall short.
Yes, ma'am.
It does.
Yes.
Okay. And that's one of the things in the audit finding that they criticize us for, that we're not operating this enterprise fund at a level that it should be, where it's being supplanted with income that's coming in from the general fund, correct?
The more specifically, the audit found that the net position of the fund itself was in a deficit, generally caused by the rate being insufficient, but equally important, the OPEB liability change that occurred a few years ago, where we needed to report OPEB on an annual basis, and now we need to report it as the full cost burden. So we are in a position now where we have seen the general fund starting to support the solid waste fund to make up the difference on an annualized basis from a budgetary perspective.
That's just to make up for the OPEB.
No, the OPEB change is a booking. We'll call it like a booking calculation. So it's not real hard dollars. And I just want to make sure that I look at my CFO to make sure I'm not speaking out of line, but I think that's the best way to explain it.
Okay.
impacts your expenses on your income statement, but it's not cash. Because it's not cash, so you have to make those payments on that.
Mhm.
But the other thing I think, while, going forward, these deficits, if we dealt with them from other revenue sources, I'm sorry, the general fund would be the likely candidate to supplement. But I think the other thing historically is you sustain this by using up reserves as well. So you had some reserves in the past, and we've basically worked through those reserves. So again, one of the reasons to have a nice reserve balance is obviously you can postpone a rate increase for a year or two and use reserves if they're healthy. But in this case, those opportunities to use those reserves are no longer exist because they're gone.
Okay, so part of this rate increase is to ramp up bringing in revenue to, in a very short period of time, get those reserves up to a level that that meets our emergency funding requirement or policy, and also just to have operating reserves where they need to be.
Yes, sir.
So
Yes, sir.
that's why it's a drastic change, because we're doing in a short window of time, a large cash grab to fill those reserves up.
Right, and now we did phase it in over 5 years, so that is a short period of time. I grant you that, but
It's
I
a
mean-
short period of time when you're talking several $1 million that go into.
that's right,
accounts.
that's right.
When you're talking about something that we're collecting $25 a month from
That's right.
residents. So
right.
it's a lot of money in a very short period of time. Do we have the option of taking money out of our reserves right now and putting those in those accounts just to go ahead and avoid us from having to make these large jumps in a short window to build up those reserves?
So as I want to make sure I understand the question, are you saying take the money out of general fund
Yes.
reserves?
Yes.
Well, I think, again, the intent is for the enterprise fund to be self-supporting,
Absolutely.
but
Absolutely.
you have that discretion.
Okay.
If the general fund has the funds, you
Okay.
certainly have that discretion.
Well, you're absolutely right. I mean, the enterprise fund has to be self-sustaining. It has to, we're not making a profit on it. It's supposed to be able to operate, and it has to be operated as almost its own individual business that makes enough revenue to cover all its expenses. Okay. I can't fix the past, and you guys brought up the past, so I'm going to bring it up again. Can you bring up number 7, please? Slide 7. This is always a bone of contention with me, and I guess I'm still baffled by this. So we talked about history here. And the last rate increase was done in 2008. And you've already stated that disposals are a major cost for us, obviously. Okay. I'll wait till we get here so I can show you. So we had a rate increase 2 to 3%. That was down in 2008. That's prior to me being in office. But since I've been in office in 2009, we had a significant change in our disposal rate that I don't see here historically. It's always conveniently left out, which really annoys me. Okay, because it was a significant one. We were over $100 a ton in a tipping fee with Resource Recovery Board. Is that correct? We're well over $100. Okay, they renegotiated that and told us that $75 is going to be a great deal for us, which it was. $25 a ton. That's, let's say, even if it was at $100 tipping rate, that's a 25% decrease. Actually, what happened when we signed the new contract, it dropped to around the $45 a ton tipping fee. That's what it switched to. Am I incorrect in that? Okay. So that's tremendous amount of savings to the city. where did that money go? Because we didn't cut the rates when we got that less tipping fee, because the rate decrease that we, small rate decrease that we got doesn't match the tremendous amount of savings when we renegotiated our tipping fees from $100 plus to less than $50. We certainly didn't do a 50% decrease. We didn't do a 25% decrease. We didn't do a 20% decrease. Okay. We did a 9% reduction, and that was in 2015. And part of that, I believe, was because we received the one-time payment of $1.7 million. So in other words, we saved all this money with getting a new tipping fee, which magically doesn't show up in this slide here. But I guess it's not historically significant, but it should be, because it makes me wonder, where the hell did all that money go?
So proportionally, let me give you an observation. A 25% decrease in the disposal cost wouldn't equate to a 25% decrease in rates, right? Because you've got your collection costs, your labor costs, your fuel costs, all the other costs. So
That's fair.
yeah, so I wouldn't think that you could expect a one-for-one
Okay.
percentage drop.
Okay.
And you did reduce the rates about 9%. Now, I'm not fully cognizant of all that history, because I've come on here recently, but, you know, we could go back and look at that in terms of the proportion of costs at that time, and that might help you understand more, but I suspect that part of the issue here, you know, it was only one component of the overall cost.
Yeah. I understand that it's not going to be equivalent to that, but obviously it's a big cost that's factored in, and it doesn't show up anywhere here in a price reduction to the residents, anywhere.
And so, well, again, I would submit that at least that 9% was an attempt to do that. And also keep in mind that the infusion of cash you got, as well as any changes in rates versus the change in disposal costs, it may well have been a reason why you were able to sustain your rates for as long as you did. Okay, in other words, you know, it's been since 2015, another 7 years, and it's only recently that we've kind of run into this issue with respect to reserves and the fact that, again, looking at next year, the current rate won't even pay operating expenses. But so there was some benefit, I would tell you, for ratepayers, most likely because it allowed you to go a few years without increases, that without the disposal increase, you would have otherwise probably had to have increase.
That's what you're guessing it is.
That's
your guess
that's my
sitting here.
guess.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Okay.
because it's difficult to understand how you could go that many years without some kind of increase, given that your cost of operations and labor costs are growing. So again, I would suspect that, you know, maybe if the reduction wasn't fully passed on, you had a little margin that kept the cash balances strong. And I'd have to go back and look, you know, we look at the last year or two of history and these things, but I'd have to go back to know that for sure. I'd have to look back over the last decade more carefully.
Okay. Yeah, I would love to know where all that money is. And it's never shown in these slides. So it's very frustrating for me, having historical history of sitting here and constantly being baffled when it comes to this enterprise fund. It's my opinion that something needs to be, I think it's too much to pass on to fill up these reserves in that short amount of window for such a significant amount of money to do that and try to make it all up in rate increases. I think that's a little too brutal on the residents. We have seen property values go up. We've seen our revenues overall in the city go up, to which our reserves, and this is what I pointed out during budget time, we have extraordinarily healthy reserves. If we want to set this department right and set this enterprise fund right, it might be, and since we're able and we have the discretion to do that, it might make sense to take those emergency reserves and the other reserves you talked about that we need to get to, that we take that money in as an injection from the general fund or wherever else to bring those up to where they need to be, increase the rates to say, here's our clean slate. Our reserves are where they need to be. This is what we have. What is the rate that we need to come up with to keep up with inflation? Because we have to make sure that the rates represent what our cost is to run it, okay? If historically, if we look at the last 10 years of, we don't know what the hell happened to that money, and yeah, we used it up to not have a rate increase, let's wipe the slate clean, take the money out of the reserves, put it in there, get it where it needs to be, and then figure out where the rates need to go from there and move in that direction. That's my opinion.
And the outcome of that strategy would be we'd only need to raise the rates then to meet the operating and capital needs
Absolutely.
as opposed to the cash.
Right.
reserves.
Right. That would be my suggestion. And I would imagine, we're talking $5 million? $3
Let
million
me
for
go
the
back to,
emergency
I'm looking for that number for the
Yeah.
reserve.
So about $8.5 million. What's that? Yeah, Adam? Okay. So about $5.25 million would go in there. Okay. That's just a suggestion that I have. That's a big number, but at least
I'm looking at one of the charts that showed your operating expenses growing over time. And, it starts out, they start out at about 17.4 million growing to 22 million. So if we look at that infusion to the reserve fund, overall of our rate path, if you will, I'm just, don't hold me to this because we'll come back with some, if you want, we'll come back with some perspectives on it that are more accurate, but it's probably about 5% of the cumulative increase. We could probably, that while it's a lot of money, keep in mind, you're collecting, close to 20 million a year in revenue. So to add 5 million over 5 years is roughly $1 million a year. Okay. So that's, if I'm calculating it correctly, based on these rough statistics, the curve would come down about 5% overall.
And you were suggesting what percentage of the rate increase right now?
Well,
That's, Mayor, that's on page 25, what the recommendation was. So we'll,
now that's cumulative. So that's right. So what I'm suggesting to you is that as the rates rise over the next 5 years, cumulatively, they would be 5% lower at the end point than what we've set forth here.
Well, I don't know if everybody can hear us.
Yeah, I think.
Hello.
When we talked about that portion that had to do with leasing, I just was wondering what would be the differential cost between a lease agreement versus procedures to purchase? And is it a real saving for the city actually to lease? At the end of the lease agreement, where are we? Did we save money or let me just ask this, were there any other options, any other alternatives that we could have considered rather than just the lease agreement?
So, couple thoughts. One is we could make these programs costing for the business.
Mhm.
So if we have the funds to purchase the vehicle, we could get cheaper than if we did.
Mhm.
So the leasing program could say there's a saving, but what it does do is it gives us the capital to do vehicle replacement that we don't have.
Mhm.
So to do it pay as you go, to pay for it and not use it, we would have to raise them. We have to raise the rate. If we did it from rate,
Mhm.
we have to raise them significantly.
Right.
So what the lease does is it amortize the cost of the truck
Mhm.
and spread it out over time.
Mm.
And again, we don't have enough to do. Again, it's a short window, 5 years, and then it comes out. So if we started increasing rates instead of 2 to 5 years, it would be even higher. So what we've done here, the strategy that was recommended to you is in the short run, I don't see we have. Otherwise, you're going to continue to operate. In the long run, we want to carefully transition by, again, as we improve the health of the enterprise, we want to get where these leases come off. That we use that same money to invest in the retail, and then start buying it.
Mhm. Well, yeah, that's what I would want is that we would actually be able to purchase our vehicles as opposed to lease. But what I asked was there any other consideration, any other options? And what I'm hearing is that either or, either you lease, which is the best thing for us now, is what I'm hearing, versus buying, because we're not in a position to do that. Is that what I'm hearing?
If I can just clarify real quick, it's not a lease in a traditional sense like you would think about leasing a car.
Mhm.
It's a lease purchase option. So what it is basically we lease purchase we actually do purchase the vehicles, and then we enter into a lease purchase arrangement with the bank where we pay that off over a certain period of time, in most cases 3 to 5 years. So we're not leasing it, whereas, if we go over 10,000 miles, we got to pay more. It's not that situation. We own the vehicle.
Mhm.
We own the vehicle.
Mhm. Okay. Yeah. Okay. That's the help. No, it's not making sense. It's still working down. Okay. That's good, man.
That'll work. You hear me, I presume? I guess the first question I have is I'm really not excited about taking from our reserves. We all saw what happened in Naples, 6 weeks ago, and that could have been us. That's my personal opinion. Our residents have not had an increase since 2008. So, 12 years is a long time, while our expenses have gone up 35% since 2008. Our residents have not seen any of that. I understand, the apprehension, everything is going up for ourselves, for residents. So I understand that we don't want to pass on these costs. We don't have a reserve fund for this fund, and I just don't know that robbing Peter to pay Paul is the way to go. I understand why we have these reserves, and it's great that we do have them. But to pull, $5.25 million out of our reserves, I'm not sure is the best way to go long term.
I think the first thing before we decide to raise rates is you're gonna have to prove to me that we've streamlined all efficiencies first. Before we pass anything on to the residents, that we've streamlined everything that we can streamline. I did make notes and I saw in the presentation of where we've minimized expenditures. But there really wasn't any recommendations how to continue to minimize expenditures going forward. We've told what we've done, but what can we do going forward? Is this the end of the road? Is there absolutely nothing else that we can do to continue to minimize expenditures? If so, I think we need to be told that because that's not clear from the presentation, and that's going to have to be proven to me first before we go forward. I will say, looking at my notes, that one of the options of tweaking the service levels, I don't think is going to go over well with the residents. Changing the level of service from 2 days a week to 1 day a week, eliminating bulk, whatever combination thereof we could put together. I don't think that would go over well. It's something that I really don't want to contemplate from a policy perspective going forward. As far as what to do, there may be some hybrid of the different combinations of tools that we have at our disposal here. There's no one, no pun intended, no one thing that we have to do. I would like to know more about this emergency fund. I mean, I hear that's a city policy, not a state requirement. So where did that come from? Maybe it's something, do other cities have this emergency fund? Do we need this emergency fund? Is it something that we can eliminate and just have reserves? I mean, we have reserves and then an emergency fund on top of that. Are both of those required? Are both of those normal? I'd like to hear a little bit more about that, going forward as well. If one of those can be reduced or eliminated, that would take some stress off where we would have to come up with additional funds as well. But we're going to have to do something going forward. I understand, but I think we're going to have to cobble bits and pieces together to make this work.
I had not considered the mayor's suggestion before in just going over notes and just hearing the presentation. But I think it deserves some debate, because there were some good points that were made. Now, my thing is when we look at the reserves, what then becomes by definition that those reserves? What are they for? What do we use them for? If not for situations like this, then what do we use them for? Now, what he was suggesting, if I'm remembering, I don't mean to speak for him, but he was like making it clean, just giving an even start. And maybe a fresh start is what we need in a situation like this in order to just wipe the slate clean going forward. There's less confusion and we don't go over a lot of these things again. Like I said, it just deserves maybe some debate for us to talk about it, because maybe in that debate we can actually find a solution. But I don't think it's such an aberration and so far-fetched that it wouldn't work and it's not a good thing. But when we talk about reserves, taking money out of the reserves, when will we ever take it out? What do we need it for if we're never going to use it? That becomes my question. What do we have there for? Just to sit and look at it? Yes, sir.
I'm not answering your question, but I'd like to offer an additional perspective to consider. We're on the first of 3 discussions, and I think you'll find a similar issue with the other 3. So I don't know that this is a sustainable solution. At least if it is for this, we have 2 more issues like this that are extremely severe that we'd want to take the time to bring to your attention: the stormwater and the utilities fund. So I just want to offer that as a perspective, because if that is a solution, it then would have a significant impact on overall reserves. And I think what we have worked with the consultant to do is offer, a gradual ramp up to address our operational needs, which continue to be increasing, our capital needs, our market conditions, some of which we have very little control over. And, in response to Commissioner Droska's question, we may not be able to prove that everything has been done, but we're at a stage, for example, with our fleet, that you know, if the average is 10 years and we're 12, and then we're repairing everything, and on a regular basis, we have the hydraulics leak and we've got to repair that, and then we have the motor leak or get damaged, and we've got to address that. Then we have the transmission. You know, it's not that we can necessarily prove it, but it's a significant impact on our operational costs, on our ability to operate, and some of those other things. So I understand the question, but certain things you can't prove, but we have taken a number of steps that's been documented. We have compared with industry averages and even in terms of the age of our fleet, recognizing also as I talk about fleet, that any fleet now that is ordered is going to be another 2 years or so. So if you have an 11-year unit, you talk about by the time you get it, you know, maybe 13 or 14 years, susceptible to a lot of the additional wear and tear and breakdown. So I don't know that I'm answering the question. I just want to offer that perspective as you continue to.
And I appreciate that, but I would still say that, let's just say the other two presentations ends up exactly where we are here. In other words, that we have some sort of a financial crisis that, or at least there are a situation that can lead us in that way. But still, the conversation about our reserve may lead us into some sort of a hybrid solution. And the idea is that if we talk about it and we debate it, even for the other three, maybe there is a solution that we can come up with that will affect all three. The conversation should be had just to discuss exactly the details and of where each problem that we have, what's the details of it. Then let us all get on the same page and say, you know something, and the general fund being a part of that conversation. Maybe not going all for one or whatever the case may be, but maybe there's a solution through debate.
Well, I can say the beauty of this diocese is we've always looked at all solutions with open minds. So I don't think anybody is just shutting anything down. You know, this is right now a discussion. To Commissioner Drosky's point or question, you know, the recommended life of a vehicle is 8 years, and ours are already over 11 years. And again, it's going to be 2 years, you know, if we order it today before we get it. Who knows what happens next year if we order it? Labor cost is going through the roof. And if any of you were at the State of the City yesterday, Commissioner Drosky does have experience in driving these vehicles. And I'm sure he would offer, you know, at least one route a day or maybe a week to help supplement some of that. On a serious note, this is a serious subject, but we definitely need to find a solution. The can has been kicked down the road since 2008, and we've obviously previous dioceses have done things to keep it afloat as long as it has. But unfortunately, the buck stops again with this diocese, and we're going to have to make some tough decisions.
Well, my thing is that you were saying not kicking the can down the road, and we shouldn't. But whatever decision that we would make as a unit would keep us from ever kicking the can again. So we don't want to be pushed into a situation where we don't make the best decision, because when we're dealing with money and we're dealing with crisis, sometime we can make bad decisions based on what is in front of us. I'm just saying, let's look at all the details, all of them.
But I don't want to make a quick decision.
I agree with that.
That
I
is
agree
just
with that.
trying to fix 17 years worth of not.
And I agree
solving it
with
at
you
that point.
100%.
Because I don't want to set any kind of precedent that 10 years from now, another diocese, well, they did, we'll do it too.
Right.
And then pretty soon, all of a sudden, a hurricane hits and we got, you know, a lot less reserves than we should for our residents.
Okay. Thank you, guys. We want to take a 5-minute break before we roll into the next one, if that's okay.
Get a jacket for Drosky.
No. It earned everything.
Oh, no, that's so funny. Oh, that's funny.
It is.
That's
Isn't it? No. Priscilla, are you up next? Good.
You can see them.
Hey, let's talk about it. Because that's a great point. I had not considered it. I didn't consider it. But you know what? There's some merit there. We talked out. The only thought that I would say is that I would come up with those things, those people that put them in place and, you know, and do that. Oh boy. That's right. Yeah. Yeah.
Because I think he's like, I think he's an engineer. Because, Little Ron is allegedly. Ready to reconvene? Within 5 minutes? Let's start back.
Good evening, Priscilla Sigalnik, Director for Environmental Services. Tonight, we're here to give you an update on the progress regarding our water and wastewater rate studies. As you might recall, in April, we came to you with some recommendations to implement an immediate rate adjustment. That was based on a plan that we had conducted back in 2020. We had initially put a hold on the original plan from 2020 due to the impact of COVID. And since that time, we've come back to you, requested that rate adjustment. And what we told you we would do is we would go back, evaluate the rates based on some of the capital that we received from the American Rescue Plan to see what that impact would be on the recommendations that we have for a 5-year plan. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to our consultant with Carollo, Chuck Sinclair. He's going to take you through the update that they've conducted since April of this year, and tell you what the recommendations are going to be moving forward. We are looking to put this on our commission agenda for December 6th. There is a requirement for public notice, so be aware that the residents are going to be receiving a notice on their water and sewer bills, beginning with the first billing cycle tomorrow, that this public notice will be made in December.
Great, thanks, Priscilla. Chuck Sinclair, Carollo Engineers. Good to see you all again, Mayor, Commissioners. We're keeping this presentation pretty high level. We went to a lot of detail in some of the earlier workshops and public meetings that we had earlier this year. So certainly we can dive down and answer any questions you'd like. But just a reminder that we performed a master plan and a rate study. As Priscilla mentioned, we delivered a draft master plan in December of 2019. Where we evaluated the existing condition and performance of the utility systems. We looked at the system and the facilities needed to meet future demands, and we recommended a list of projects from the capital for a capital improvement program. We handed that over to Henry and their team, and they looked at and developed a financial forecast of how they would be able to fund that program, evaluated the revenue available, and then recommended a plan to fund operating costs and capital improvements. And again, as Priscilla mentioned, we delivered that in March of 2020, and COVID literally shut us down a week after we met with staff, and everything kind of went on hold until we picked it back up late last year. Next slide, Smith. So our recommended capital improvement program included CIPs for both the 5-year and the 20-year horizon. So we wanted to look at not just short-term, what we needed in 5 years, but also long-term, what the system would need in terms of renewal and replacement and additional capital over a 20-year horizon. We wanted to fund a R&R program for each of the main components of the utility. We looked at cost for both short and long-term capital projects, as I mentioned. A time estimate for each project based on the capacity and the demand projections of when we would need these projects. And then the CIP would really serve as a basis of the revenue and rate sufficiency study. We put all this on this big spreadsheet, and what it allowed us to do is identify all the projects by type, by funding category, and then it allowed us some opportunity to kind of play with the timing and the duration, so we could project out the cash flow and when we would need the funding, again, over a 20-year horizon. For the 5-year CIP, here's a summary of the major elements. And, as we had shared with you before, the system had some real needs. There had been not a lot of replacement and renewal projects. Many of the components of the system had exceeded its useful life. So you'll see some of the items here, and I won't list them all by name, but one of the key components is a new ion exchange treatment system to essentially phase out your existing lime softening system, a much more robust state-of-the-art treatment system, which will address a a lot of the your existing water quality issues, but any future quality issues that you may be able to need to address, like PFAS and other emerging contaminants. And then, as you can see there, many other components related to the water treatment system, water mains, wastewater collection, and conveyance systems. So, go next slide. And I'm going to hand it over to Henry now, and he's just going to, again, you've seen most of these slides. He'll just kind of talk through some of the things that he and his team looked at. You'll see many of the same curves and graphs similar to what you just saw for the solid waste.
So again, this is the projection of your overall costs, and it goes back to the master plan 20-year outlook. Again, we recommended increases beginning back in 2020. There was original plan for increases. So we have not made those rate changes in the last several years. And what we had recommended to you earlier this year was to at least go back and start to increase that rate path in accordance with the original plan. And then, obviously you adopted the first year's increase, and then we're going to come back and look at it. But again, this just shows you, once again, the water wastewater fund is in a little better shape than sanitation, in that it is funding more than its operating expenses, but pretty quickly, the rate levels today are going to be in the same situation of not even being able to fund operating expenses. So next slide, please. So the original one for the 2020 financial forecast was 5 years of 7%, slightly over 7% increases. Again, that was to increase the funding for renewal and replacement and rehabilitation of assets, to fund the capital needs in the plan, including that 5-year plan that Chuck just showed you. Again, similar to sanitation, we've got some issues in the water and wastewater fund with cash reserves, and the fact that we need to replenish them to some degree. And then also we test for and look at, you have outstanding debt, so those lender obligations require you to meet certain covenants, and we test for those as well. And that plan was designed to make sure that you satisfied those lender requirements as well. Next slide, please. So this just, these are some of the same metrics that we looked at in sanitation. And I won't go over all the detail here because we're going to come back in the next workshop and bring you updates of all of this. But we're looking at both. In here, we don't have an emergency fund per se for utilities. We have a renewal and replacement, our capital fund, and then we've got the operating fund. So this just shows you, and we actually looked at it over the 20-year period, whereas the rate focus is really going to be on the next 5 years, where we track and look at the funds you have available for renewals and replacements, as well as operating. And one of the reasons we need reserves, for example, too, is to help levelize the funding of the capital needs for renewal and replacement. Because as you can imagine, capital expenditures are lumpy. They don't just trend like operating costs. One year you may have a big expense, the next year it may be lower. So when we do these 5-year plans, what we're trying to do is come up with a funding algorithm that gets you through 5 years. So 1 year it may increase the R&R reserve a little bit. And the next year we may have to use that money for that one-time project. So we're trying to do it as best we can in a steady hand approach, where we're looking out and not trying to deal with things on a year-by-year basis, but look at it over time. Next slide, please. So this just shows that with the rate plan, how we were trying to build back the reserves. Again, we're going to bring you updated information, and the focus is really going to be on the first 5 years, which is what we need to manage the horizon we manage the rates over. Next slide, please. This just shows you again that we are tracking your rate covenants and your debt service coverage requirements. Again, these are all the elements that go into this. And while we've been updating things, you know, we've looked at the demands, we've looked at the new funding, and here fairly shortly, we're going to be back with our update. But again, these are the kind of metrics that we're looking at. Next slide, please. Okay, so again, the proposed rate increases in 2020 were based on the forecast of the operational and the capital costs. It did look at a 20-year horizon. However, like I said, we kind of got off to a slow start with COVID. We deferred some of those increases, and now we're going to try to pick the path back up so that you can fund your operating capital needs. And again, we're going to focus on 5 years.
So this was a recommendation that we made back in April, and you approved an incremental initial rate increase. We felt confident that the work that we had done, even though it was dated a couple of years, could justify the initial rate increase of 7.1%, which you approved in April. We have one of the things that we really wanted to look closely at were updated population projections and updated demands on your water and sewer system, because we were anxious to see if things post-COVID had changed any of that. And what we've discovered is that there is not a significant change in the population growth or the demand in the water and sewer. So that's good news. There's a couple of other things that we're trying to get our arms around. One is that costs have continued to escalate. We all know that. That's not news. So trying to sharpen our cost estimates for our R&R and our CFP projects is something that we're really trying to get a handle on, and so that we can hone in as much as we can. And then, as Henry alluded, we're also looking at additional revenue funding sources that may be available to be able to add that into our revenue stream and offset some of the additional costs. Next slide, please. So this is what the impact was at the 2022 increase, and I just put a gold bar there around the average residential user that would use about 6,000 gallons a month. The monthly bill, if you recall, that rate had been 14, 15 years, had not been increased. So we did increase that by your approval, 7.1%, which is just over $4 in the monthly bill. Next slide, please. And this is how that compared with other Broward and Palm Beach utilities. A little hard to read on this graphic, but the first green box is the rate for 2022. You can see that when you increase the rates for 2023, it was still well below the average of other utilities. Oh, thank you. Thank you. It was still well below the rate of other utilities and below the rate of Broward County. So even though there was that rate increase, it's still significantly less than average. And a reminder, I think you all will recall that about 70% of your residents actually are served by the Deerfield Beach utility. The other 30% of your residents are actually served by Broward County. So they're paying the Broward County rate. Next slide, please. So the next step on recommendations, I mentioned we're updating the master plan, the revenue sufficiency studies. I referenced the population projections, the good news, I think good news there. Updating the financial data, we're able to get the costs from closing out 2022. So that'll be able to give us a real good idea of where we are at the end of 22. So when we come back to you, we'll have some confidence moving forward with our recommendation. And then looking at other financing alternatives. And I think everyone's aware that you've received a substantial amount of ARPA funds, which they have been able to utilize to do some of your capital and R&R projects. So step 2A would be recommending to adopt a 5-year rate schedule, which would allow planning of capital and operational needs and also allow consideration of additional financing alternatives like revenue bonds, loans, matching grants, et cetera. Next slide. So we're not here today to say that rate schedule is going to be 7.1%. We think it's going to be in that ballpark. But just to use that as a benchmark, what does that mean for a 5-year increase over 5 years? So you can see from 2023, the rate, and this is again for average user of 6,000 gallons a month, you would increase the bill in 23 to for $4.42, and that would increase incrementally over 5 years to up to 5.82% annually. And you can see that the kind of the cumulative increase there would be $29. So what does that look like compared to other utilities? Samantha can go to the next slide. I think it's the next slide. So here you can see again, your existing rates, once you adopted back in April of 62.28. If we increased that rate 7.1% over the next 5 years, it would be $87.84. So just over utilities average for today. So updated information on this graphic, on this chart, the rates for the other utilities in this sample size went up about 1.5, about 1.5% from last year. So if they were to continue to increase at 1.5 for the next 5 years, the black dashed line, the other utilities average would be about $90. So even with this increase somewhere in the ballpark of 7+%, you would still be estimated to be below the average of these other sample utilities in Broward and Palm Beach. That's what we have for you here today. And again, we can go back and revisit any of the details of some of the information that we presented to you earlier this year.
Thank you. The first question I have, so 30% of our residents are paying $83.15, while 70% of our residents are paying $62.28. Those 30% of those residents, that I presume that's former unincorporated Broward County. So those are some of our residents that are on the lower income scale. Is that correct? So the residents who are more financially challenged are paying $20 a month more than the rest of the residents of the city. Thank you.
I understand it. I mean, there's obviously a dynamic here between fund and the residents. There's a human component to this. I mean, going an extra $30 a month increase. I don't know. It's a tightrope, and I'm struggling with that because on the one hand, I have a responsibility to the city to make sure that these funds are, operate as they're intended to, but I also have a responsibility to the residents who elected us up here as well to make sure that they're protected and we're doing everything that we can on our end. And I struggle to see which side of the line that I'm on with this, but it's something that I need to think about. 7.1% over every year. I mean, I doubt my residents are getting increases of 7.1% year over year. And this is just one of the 3 funds. So this is times 3 that we're having this discussion. So I don't know if anyone else is in their districts are having residents getting 7.1% increases every year, but I don't think it's happening in District 4. So that's the dynamic we're going to have to figure out.
So Mayor, before we conclude this, I'd just like to add that with this, it's a little bit different because some of these would need to be addressed in terms of safety concerns. Some of them are regulatory concerns that would need to be addressed, some of it outside of our control. There's also the need because most of these are long-term, maybe a 4 or 5 year horizon. So in terms of planning for them, and many of them, if it impacts the underground utilities, then it also would be good to integrate with either stormwater or repaving, so we're not impacting the roads multiple times, and we can schedule and coincide whatever repairs or upgrades need to be done. So also wanted to point that out as we offer this recommendation to you. And we'll move on to the stormwater now.
All right. So tonight I'll have Rob Taylor joining us with Hazen Sawyer. If you recall, Hazen Sawyer was the consultant that was originally retained back in 2018 when we were proposing the creation of the stormwater utility. And we've retained them again to reevaluate how we're doing 4 years later, especially after we've adopted our stormwater master plan. So if you recall, back in November of 2021, we adopted the city's area-wide stormwater master plan and flood resiliency plan. And that plan included up to $18 million worth of capital improvements as an immediate need throughout the city. So what we tasked Hazen Sawyer with is to evaluate the solvency of this fund to do operations and maintenance and capital. And so that's what Rob's here to talk to you all about today.
Great. Thank you, Priscilla. Before I get started, I do want to acknowledge my colleagues on line with us virtually, Jamie Leonard and Alan Karnovitz, who worked closely with the city to put together tonight's materials and are working primarily on the work that's ongoing now that Priscilla described. Just to start off, basically, the stormwater system, obviously a critical system within the city, helps to keep you free of flooding, helps to provide water quality treatment for waters discharged to your receiving waters. It's there to serve your roadways and developed areas. We interface with it on a daily basis. Sometimes we don't even recognize we do, but it's those swales along our local roadways. It's those storm drains that we see along the streets at the intersections. And a lot of it is underneath the ground in the way of piping that those drains drain to and collect that water and take it to places and keep it out of places we don't want it. Next. And so like the other enterprises that we've already heard about this evening, back in 2018, the city decided that they would treat stormwater as an enterprise, and you created the Stormwater Utility Fund. At that point in time, the idea was that we would cover the operation and maintenance costs associated with stormwater out of the charge that was levied against residents and businesses, with the idea that once you had finished your master planning process, we would then come back and address how the capital would be handled. So in 2020, you completed the Stormwater and Flooding Resiliency Master Plan. It laid out a series of prioritized capital projects that cover the entire community of Deerfield. Fortunate to say that you have some of those projects already underway with the ARPA funds that you have received, but obviously a lot of additional funding necessary to tackle the remaining capital projects on slate. Next, please.
Rob, if I can, real
Sure.
quick, just that we, even despite the fact that wasn't necessarily intended that we'd be able to get a lot of capital done, we still have. There are several projects that we've been able to complete and betterments to various neighborhoods through the Stormwater Utility Fund. So we have had some capital funding that we've been able to manage either with the existing fee structure of the stormwater or grant funding that we've received. So we've been successful in that.
Thanks. So the operation and maintenance costs, where are those funds primarily, outside of the capital that was just mentioned? They're covering the cost of your city employees, the equipment and materials necessary for them to do their work to keep up this system. It is not a small task. I know that the numbers are small up there, but it's quite an extensive system that they're responsible for the upkeep, renewal, replacement of. So that includes
cleaning those systems, inspecting them routinely. You have some reporting processes that you're responsible for. And there is a vast array of assets that need to be taken care of on a continual basis. Thank you. Next. Next, please. So the Stormwater and Flooding Resiliency Master Plan identified a significant number of projects that need to be addressed. They cover everything from drainage improvement projects. We mentioned the fact water quality treatment, big issue for us here in South Florida. Protecting coastal resources, dealing with tidal flooding, and then an array of other targeted problem studies that need to be still conducted to determine further needs. Next, please. And we've talked a little bit now about the projects off of that master plan that are already underway. Two of the most pressing needs were Southeast 8th Avenue and the Deer Run community. Again, underway with help from those ARPA funds, and then a loan from the Water and Sewer Fund. Next, please. And so that really gets us to the work that's underway now. And there are two primary pieces to this. The first is really a true up of your ERUs, your billing units that are the basis of your stormwater fund. And then the use of that reconciling of ERUs to look at alternative financing mechanisms that you might use now that we're going to tackle the capital element of your stormwater program. And then the second piece of this is really to take a look at whether or not the city wants to migrate the collection of their stormwater charges from the water and sewer bill onto the tax bill as a non-ad valorem assessment. And there are some pros and cons to both. And then some of the activities that you have to statutorily do in order to make that transition. Next, please. So this first element of work that's ongoing is really, again, just a true up of the impervious area that was used several years ago to come up with the billing units that are charged a stormwater fee. We basically use a unit called the equivalent residential unit. It is by definition the average impervious area of a representative statistical sample of your single family residential parcels. That ERU essentially becomes the cookie cutter, if you will, to determine an appropriate allocation of those costs across all of the non-residential parcels in the city. And what we're really doing here is looking at how that impervious area information has changed over the years since it was last looked at in detail. Next, please. That work is underway. It will be complete by mid-November. And it really is just a look at the GIS layer that was used, those impervious areas when we last allocated those ERUs across the parcels within the city to your current aerial imagery to see where there are new impervious areas, where there is new development, and make sure that we are fully capturing all of the billable units that can be within your rate program. And then once we have that those total billable ERUs updated, we'll use that information as we investigate the different possibilities as far as the financial scenarios. Next, please. So again, the look at the alternative financing mechanisms, also work that is underway, also due to be done mid-November. We wanted to bring before you, though, kind of an illustration of what that might look like. I think the plan is, again, to bring that back to you also on December the 6th. And so you'll have a more detailed look at it then, but just to give you some idea of what that might look like when we're back together then in December, we've made some assumptions that your ERU count is growing at a pace of about 1% per year. What we would expect in a mature community like Deerfield And we've made some assumptions relative to the escalation cost in your O&M budgets. Next, please. So this shows kind of a breakdown of the pieces that make up the stormwater costs, your personnel, your operation and maintenance costs, now layered in I'm not sure what color that is. It's kind of a blue. It is the estimated capital that Priscilla mentioned. You can see the red bar, which is kind of where your revenue stream would be now. Again, realizing that it was not intended initially to cover that capital component, and then where we would need to take that to fully fund your stormwater costs and expenses in the enterprise. Next, please. So we're looking at 3 scenarios. The first is a pay-go scenario. Essentially, under that, and really under all of these scenarios, we will be paying back that $2.2 million loan that came from the Water and Sewer Fund. But on the pay-go side, just as the name infers, essentially you're going to be building your capital infrastructure at the pace at which the revenues you collect are able to fund that. So it's a little slower go if you take things that direction. The other 2 options, both financing options, either with public financing or with private financing, really the primary difference between those 2 is probably just the interest rate that you would pay on the financing. A little lower on the public side of things, but probably some strings and other things that go with that lower rate. And under all these scenarios, we've built a contingency, a cushion, if you will, for uncertainties that we should know more about by the time we come back with the final study in mid-November. Next, please. And so this gives you an idea of how the pay-go versus the 2 financing options might look. Again, the pay-go option, we're collecting at a significantly higher rate, but that's the reasons for that are twofold. 1, we can only build as fast as we collect those revenues, and 2, that money would be collected over a significantly shorter time than both of the financing options, which basically we're borrowing the money, you can build sooner, and you're just simply paying off the cost of that loan over a 20-year period. Next, please. And so this is kind of graphically what, again, a scenario of the 2 options might look for, or it might look like. And you know, depending upon what you would do with future capital needs beyond what was in your master plan, renewal and replacement might dictate what those curves look like when you go out beyond 2028. Next. And so like the other presentations before this one, this shows a comparison of where you are currently compared to the other stormwater utilities in the area, Palm Beach and Broward County primarily. I think Miami-Dade County is also in there. So you're at the lower end of things, which is kind of to be expected because you right now are, again, only financing or funding the operation and maintenance portion of your enterprise out of these fees. If you were to go under any of the scenarios that we just talked about, you're probably going to end somewhere closer to middle of the pack, maybe a little further up on the middle of the pack. What's important to note about these is that you really kind of have to understand what each of these communities is doing as far as supplementing their enterprise. Not everybody is funding the full cost of their program through these charges. And so you kind of have to understand that to understand how you really fit in with the rest of the group. Next, please. So this is the, if you will, the second part of the work underway, and that is the idea of migrating this charge to a non-ad valorem assessment. that work again underway. And probably the biggest lift in all of this is being able to take the data, the impervious area data, which right now, if you think about the charge being levied on a water account, so attributable to a specific water meter, the impervious areas are divided up slightly differently than they would be for certain parcels when we start to look at them on a parcel basis, as divided up by the property appraiser and tax collector. So the biggest piece of this is making that data transition so that now we have impervious areas appropriately assigned to parcels as kept in the property appraiser's records. And this, if you were to go this way, would end up on a trim notice in the summer of 2023 and on the tax bill that would come thereafter. Next, please. So there is an important implementation schedule associated with this. This uniform method of collection is covered under the Florida statutes, and so it's important to meet the statutory requirements. You will have to enter into an agreement with the property appraiser and tax collector relative to their administrative costs associated with this effort. By the end of the year, you have to adopt a resolution of intent at a properly noticed public hearing, stating that you want to use the uniform method to collect this non-ad valorem assessment. And the plan right now is that that would happen on December the 6th. Requires that it be noticed 4 times for 4 weeks prior to that public hearing. And so the publication dates in a newspaper of local circulation would occur on November the 8th, 15th, 22nd, and 29th in order to meet the statutory requirement. Next, please. And then after that, the process kind of unfolds, and that sometime before June 1st, property appraiser is going to send you a copy of all of a file with a list of all the properties that can be assessed. And then it would be the city's obligation to develop an assessment roll, adopt and certify that at a public hearing no later than September the 15th, submit that to the tax collector the same way you would do annually with your millage rate. And again, that would have to be publicly noticed appropriately, not only in a newspaper, but the first time you're doing this also by individual mailing to each of the parcels that is expected to be assessed. And I think that is about it. If you've got any questions, I'm glad to try to answer them.
So first of all, what's the percentage of the cities that follow this non-ad valorem path as opposed to how we're doing it now?
Jamie, I don't know whether you have the numbers out of the Florida Stormwater Association. It is their the predominant mechanism is still a water and sewer bill where that is available to use as a mechanism. Part of the complication that I think that Deerfield has, as was mentioned in the previous presentation, is that you have 2 different utilities who are providing that utility service to you. So it complicates things a little bit. I will say that we have recently transitioned a couple, Oakland Park just went through this. Trying to think of who else we just did. It's administratively, I would say that it is a cleaner process because sometimes the allocation of those impervious areas to water accounts when you get into multifamily units and commercial units is a little bit more difficult, very straightforward when you're looking at parcel data from the property appraiser and tax collector.
So is it a straight as opposed to $375 a month? It's $45 a year.
Yeah, there are some nuanced differences. There are certain properties that won't pay on a non-ad valorem assessment. One of those being the school board, but I don't think at this juncture the school board is even paying these charges when they're placed on a water and sewer bill.
Are there any other entities that would
federal properties, unless they have specifically agreed to pay them will not.
And let me add, this is Jamie Leonard with Hazen and Sawyer. Let me add the most recent Florida Stormwater Association survey noted that 35% of surveyed utilities utilize the non-ad valorem or special assessment for the basic methodology for the revenue generation with respect to a stormwater fee collection.
Thanks for finding that, Jamie. Appreciate it.
Absolutely.
I think the question was nonprofits and religious, they would still be obligated to pay. There's no exemption for them. There's not, I mean, you always have the discretion to make those kinds of choices. I'm aware of past utilities where they have used this method and decided that they, for what other reasons, didn't want to do that. I would tell you that if you were to exempt some classification of property, that it would not be appropriate for you to then allocate their portion of that cost to the other parcels that were assessed.
I'm not against putting it on the tax bill in theory. I see the benefit to it, you know, because we basically guaranteed to get paid at some point, sooner probably than later, because otherwise if it's on the bill, then you're chasing delinquent accounts and trying to get reimbursed that way. So I understand the benefit to it, but going so fast, putting on a December 6th meeting and rushing it through for next year seems a little fast for me. Government never goes this fast, and now all of a sudden we're going fast. Doesn't make any sense to me. So I have some hesitation then, because considering, you know, we have 3 agenda items tonight, and we need to look at all 3 together and not piecemeal. I don't want to incrementally negotiate against myself on these. Like, oh, okay, we'll give an increase here, and then we got 2 other issues that we still have to deal with. So I need to look at this globally, and I don't think we're going to globally resolve this by the December 6th meeting. So I've got some hesitation in that regard. Not against it, but I think there's just a bigger picture. We've been given a lot of information, a lot to think about tonight, and I just don't see that all getting sifted out in a couple weeks.
Maybe one thing that might help a little bit with that is that your decision to adopt a resolution of intent to use the method were you to do it on December 6th doesn't obligate you to make that change. It simply protects your ability to be able to do that. I know a lot of communities that have, some of them historically have had a long list of things that they will pass a resolution of intent that they may levy an assessment for a certain capital improvement, certain benefit, benefit area within a community, and then they don't follow through on it. And sometimes that goes on for years. But I just wanted to make sure you knew that if you do that on December 6th, and you decide sometime in calendar year 2023 that the timing isn't right, or for whatever reason you didn't want to proceed, you're not obligated to make that change.
So Mayor and Commissioners, I appreciate you being here, especially on the second night of a back-to-back event. And I don't know about other staff, but I personally enjoyed last night much better. So so we were actually here to kind of give you an overview and to get some direction. So I'll kind of summarize the direction that I think we got, so that we make sure that we're moving in the right direction in terms of steps that we anticipate. In terms of the solid waste, we offered some recommendations, and we heard that you agree with the urgency and we need to address the urgency. There was no consensus for the alternatives that we presented, included service adjustments and other things like that. There was a request to have some consideration for discussion on use of reserves. And so as such, when we returned to the commission, with the recommendation, it will probably mirror what we had now with some consideration for use of reserves, or with the ability to, if this is used, then here's the impact or something like that. In terms of the water and sewer, we offered a recommendation and we did not hear a significant consensus to vary from that. So when we return, it probably would be mirroring what you saw. With the stormwater, what we will do is to go ahead and complete the study and the analysis. Based on that, finalize the recommendation in terms of the rates and return with the updated rate schedule. Or in terms of our schedule, we had proposed also including it on the non-ad valorem billing. So we'll move forward with that. And what Rob has said, by adopting that, it preserves the option and you can decide at a later date. So that would be my takeaway, or our takeaway, in terms of how we'd be moving forward with the next step and through the next couple of meetings.
If I can just really close it out real quick, I appreciate the commission's time tonight and recognize that this is a meeting unlike what we've probably seen here in the past, where we've talked about all three enterprise funds at once and discussed what these rate adjustments may look like going forward, or what the recommendations are based on the needs analysis of maintenance, operation, and capital expenditures. But I appreciate your comments, Commissioner Drosky, that we don't want to piecemeal this, right? And that's really my intent here, is that we start consolidating these conversations a little bit more, so that the commission understands the full breadth of the necessity or the need, but also the impact, right, to the residents. Because I've heard that from several of you, tonight, and I want to make sure that when we do present this stuff, it's presented holistically, and it doesn't seem as though staff is just every couple months coming to you with a different situation. So that's really the intent of doing this. I understand it probably felt a little heavy tonight with all three enterprises coming at you at once, but please understand that was the intent of myself and staff, to try to present it in a holistic way. So I appreciate your time and your patience, and not coming straight over the table at me. So thank you.
Aye.